The officer's hand gripped his holster. "Sir, I said put your hands behind your back." The man in the navy suit didn't flinch. His calm eyes met the flashing red lights. A whisper rippled through the growing crowd. "He's not just anyone. That's Senator Elijah Brooks." And in that instant the world tilted. The night air was sharp with rain and tension. Under the dim glow of streetlights, two officers stood rigid, hands hovering near their belts, their eyes fixed on a tall black man standing before a gated building. "Sir, you can't be here," one officer said. "This is private property." The man didn't move. His suit jacket hung heavy with water, his face calm but unreadable. Behind him, the sign on the marble wall read, "Senate Annex, Restricted Access." He had every right to be there. It was his building, but the officers didn't know that. Not yet. Elijah Brooks wasn't dressed like a threat. His polished shoes reflected the rain-soaked pavement. His lapel pin, a small, golden eagle, glimmered faintly beneath the streetlight. Yet, in that moment every eye that watched saw not a leader, but a suspect. A young woman across the street clutched her phone, recording silently. Cars slowed. Faces pressed against fogged-up windows. Nobody spoke. The silence was thick, a mix of disbelief and fear. The man's hands remained at his sides, open, calm. "Officer," he said quietly, "I work here." But calm didn't matter tonight. Elijah Brooks had walked through storms far worse than this. Years before, he wore desert sand instead of city rain. As a soldier in Afghanistan, he had seen fear in eyes far younger than his own. He had led men through fire, pulled wounded friends from burning trucks, and whispered prayers over those who never made it home. When he came back, he carried those ghosts with him, not as burdens but as reminders. He studied law, driven by the belief that courage wasn't only shown on battlefields, but also in courtrooms, communities, and quiet acts of justice. His rise was quiet but steady. From city attorney to state representative, then to the United States Senate, each step earned, not given. He'd never forgotten where he came from or who watched from the margins. But tonight, standing in front of his own workplace, drenched in suspicion, it wasn't medals or titles that mattered. It was dignity. And dignity, he knew, was not something you demanded. It was something you held, even when others tried to strip it away. The older officer frowned.
"You're trespassing, sir."
"We need to see some ID." Elijah reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, his heart steady. He'd done this dance before, in airports, on sidewalks, even in his own neighborhood. Always careful, always calm. He handed over his ID card, the small plastic rectangle glinting with the seal of the U.S. Senate. But the officer barely glanced before shaking his head. "This looks fake," he muttered. A crowd had formed now, phones out, whispers rising like smoke. No one intervened. The air buzzed with quiet discomfort. Rules were being followed, protocols observed, but humanity, that was missing. When the younger officer moved behind him, handcuffs ready, Elijah didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "You're making a mistake." The older cop scoffed. "You can tell that to the judge." Rain fell harder, plastering Elijah's hair to his forehead. His briefcase slipped from his hand, landing softly on the wet ground. Inside were documents for the next morning's Veterans Affairs hearing, proposals for housing, mental health support, and better transition programs for soldiers. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Elijah looked toward the building, its grand steps, the flag rippling under the storm. He had stood on that very balcony to swear an oath to serve his country. Now he stood shackled on its doorstep. The irony wasn't lost on him, but somewhere nearby a car door opened. A man in a security uniform stepped out holding an umbrella, his eyes wide in disbelief. The security guard hurried forward. "Officers, wait! That's Senator Brooks!" Both cops froze. The younger one blinked, glancing between Elijah and the guard. "Senator?" he repeated, the word almost swallowed by the rain. The older officer's face drained of color. He looked down at the ID again, really looked this time, and saw the embossed seal, the Senate emblem, the unmistakable signature. Elijah stood silent, the cold metal still tight around his wrists. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply waited. A small crowd had gathered closer now. Cameras were still rolling. "Remove them," the guard said, his voice trembling. The older cop's hand shook as he unlocked the cuffs. "Sir, we didn't—" Elijah lifted his gaze, meeting the man's eyes with quiet steadiness. "Sometimes," he said softly, "seeing isn't the same as understanding." The words hung in the air, measured, calm, unblinking, a truth that didn't need to be shouted. Elijah adjusted his cufflinks, the faint red marks on his wrists glowing under the streetlights. "Respect," he murmured, almost to himself, "shouldn't depend on recognition." Later, as the crowd began to disperse, a reporter approached, voice trembling. "Senator, do you want to make a statement?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "The picture says enough." Those words would echo online within hours. By dawn, the video had spread across every screen in America. The image of a U.S. senator standing in the rain, calm and cuffed, became a symbol of something larger, a mirror held to the quiet prejudices still living beneath polished surfaces. News anchors debated, commentators speculated, but the most powerful response came not from politicians nor activists, but from ordinary people, teachers, veterans, parents, who shared the video with one simple caption: "This is why respect must never be assumed. It must be earned." Days later, Elijah returned to the Senate floor. The chamber fell silent as he walked in. Some stood out of courtesy, others stood out of shame. He paused at his desk, the faint marks still visible on his wrists. Then, without anger, he began to speak not about himself, but about every man and woman who had ever been misjudged before being understood. "When you see someone," he said, "see the human before the label. Because someday the person you dismiss might be the one fighting for your rights." The room was still. No applause, just reflection. Sometimes silence was louder than thunder. The rain had long stopped. The world had moved on as it always did. But that night remained etched in the nation's memory, not for its outrage, but for its grace. Elijah Brooks became a quiet symbol of restraint, dignity, and the power of calm truth. He never filed a lawsuit. He never demanded an apology. Instead, he sponsored a bill mandating cultural training for all law enforcement, a law inspired not by anger, but by hope. Because he understood something the world often forgets: that justice isn't born from humiliation, but from understanding. And sometimes, the most powerful protest is simply standing tall in silence. Some stories remind us that power isn't in how loud we speak, but in how deeply we stand for what's right. Wherever you're watching from, pause, reflect, and ask yourself, would you have spoken up that night? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in stories that honor quiet courage, subscribe for more, because the world still needs to be reminded that silent dignity is the loudest truth of all.